Today we're going to talk about industrialization. Industrialization. Industrialization is really going to change things. You know, the pre-modern world was basically agricultural. The economy was agricultural. Everything that people did revolved around food production, caring for animals that are involved with food, and so forth. Now we're going to have a whole new avenue of economy, one that the modern world will be built upon, and that's industrialized world. To do that, they need new sources of energy. As you can see from my little pictures here, that is going to happen through coal and steam. That's going to be the new energy. A lot of this stuff had been done by hand. A variety of things by hand. Yes, people use tools, but most of the engine, that is the energy behind those tools and behind that work, was done by hand. And when you begin to mechanize it, when you begin to use coal and steam, then you're going to increase productivity. Also, this is going to lead to the production of the building of factories. Because in the past, people could do their work wherever they were. They could do it in their homes. They could do it on the farm, in a barn, out in the field, wherever they are. But when you're going to start to use machines, and those machines need a power source, and the machines are very expensive, well, you're going to have to go to the machine. The machine doesn't come to you. So that means you need a factory. Also, when you invest all that money in factories, you want them to work very long hours because you want to get the most you can get out of them because they cost a lot of money. So that's going to change the way people work, really forever in various ways, but it's going to change even what people think about with work. It's also going to change the economy. We're going to see the number of people farming declines. Like in here, how many of you grew up on a farm, were involved in agriculture? 1, 2. That's about it. Okay, so 2 out of, I don't know what we got here, 20 some people. So let's say 10%. Where in the past, it would be over 90%. Okay? Over 90% of the people would be involved in agriculture in some way. Now, the other thing it changes, especially with the economy, instead of being labor intensive, it becomes capital intensive. What do I mean by that? Well, let's say you've got farmland and you need, if you got a farmland, let's say you need to plant crops. The number of acres, let's say, that you could plant is going to be dependent upon the number of people you have working, how many hours you can put into it. Okay, let's say it takes you, I don't know, so many hours to do an acre of land. You've got 100 acres or you got 1,000 acres. You're going to run out of time before you can get everything planted, and it's time sensitive. So it's labor intensive. You're going to have to hire people to help you plant if you're going to get it all planted and get it all harvested and so forth. So that was your main limiting factor for most people, was having enough workers. Now it's going to be capital intensive. Let's say I got a great idea for a business. Like some people when they came to my house, I've had several people say this, I ought to open my own pizzeria. They said that to me. They said that to me this last time. They said it to me before. I said, I can't open a pizzeria. Why? It takes a lot of money. I need a place to do that, right? I need a kitchen. I need a restaurant or something. I need equipment. I need ovens, so on and so on. I need refrigeration places and things. So, so what limits me, well, partially might be the labor, but I'm not too worried about I could get the labor, I think. It would be getting the capital, getting the money. So if you're going to build a factory to be able to do this work, you need money. Now, the other thing that happens with industrialization is it's going to change society. People had grown up on the farm. They had grown up on the farm. They had grown up living probably their whole lives pretty close to wherever they were born. You know, like most people wouldn't go much further than, say, 50 miles during their life. They say, you know, like less than 100 miles, like around 50 miles from where they were born. That's where they would work. That's where they would live. That's where they would end up dying, right? And so you have a very close-knit society. But now with factories, people begin to move to cities. They begin to move to cities. And when you move to a city, see, I grew up in a very small town. In that small town, if you grew up in a small town, you'll know what I'm talking about. Everybody knew who I was in that town. Everybody. They knew my name. They knew who my mother was. They knew who my sister was. They knew where I lived. They knew, you know, almost everything about me. A lot of stuff about me, right? Because it was a small town. Now, there's parts of that, you know, you might get tired of if you live in a small town, because it tends to mean that everybody knows. If you do something wrong, everybody also knows what you've done, right? Even before the internet, let me tell you, before the internet, there was a communication network in small towns. Somebody could do something, and before they got home, their parents would know what happened. Long before Instagram and all these other things, they knew. How did they know? It's a small town. Everybody talks. Everybody knows what's going on. Now, I remember going to a big city. Normally I went there with groups of people, but you know, sometimes you're there by yourself. And I just started, you know, it really hit me. No one here has any idea who I am. They don't know my name. They don't know where I live. They don't know anything about me. There's a sense that, you know, it's kind of exciting, I suppose. But it can also lead to trouble. If you get in trouble, also nobody knows who you are, right? And they're maybe less likely to help you. That's one thing in a small town. You get in trouble, well, people will call somebody, people come and help you. People say, okay, here's $20, pay me back later, whatever it might be. So this is going to change society when people begin to move from the countryside and move into the city where they are basically anonymous and where a lot of stuff is going on. We also see that they're going to need a lot of raw material. As they are making, whatever it is they're making as they mechanize it, and primarily the way this is going to start is with textiles, with cloth. It begins in England. I'll just tell you, spoiler alert, it begins in England. And as you begin to make the cloth, they used to make it by hand. Pretty easy to keep up with that way. But when we start to do it with a machine, we need a lot more material to make into textile. You're going to need that raw materials, and it's going to create a class difference. You're going to have people who are very wealthy who own factories, and you can have other people who work in the factories. Well, like I said, it all begins in Great Britain. You can trace it back to this guy, Jethro Tull. Have you ever heard of Jethro Tull? Well, Google him. You'll find some songs listed there. That's a band. That's a band. You probably don't know the band. But you know, listen to some of the songs. They're kind of interesting. It's a rock band with a guy playing the flute. Aren't too many of those. All right. Jethro Tull, though, was a guy who invented a seed drill. That doesn't seem too exciting. But what had happened was people in the past, when they, say, would plow the field, you would go out and then they would just scatter the seeds. They'd have a bag of seeds around their shoulder, you know, and they would just throw the seeds on the ground and hopefully they would grow. But in the process, birds would come and eat some of it, and, you know, other things would happen. So it's a kind of a waste of seeds. But a seed drill, now you load in if 3 or 4 seeds drop into it, it drops into the ground, punches a little hole, and the seeds go in it, and then it goes around. So it's kind of on a wheel, and it punches and it drops, punch and drop, punch and drop. Then you put a little thing on the back of it, it kind of covers up the hole, And now you got rows, and you're much more efficient use of the seeds. Anyway, what things that happen that lead to the Industrial Revolution is an agricultural revolution that takes place in the 18th century, which leads to the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century. I told you I was going to start talking faster. I guess I am. Anyway, so crop rotation, that is moving crops around. You don't always grow the same crop in the same field. It begins to wear the soil out, takes the nutrients out. So by rotating crops, that helps. By letting one field lie fallow, that is nothing growing in it for a season, that also helps. And a seed drill. So this means that you end up with more food, more efficient and more food. With the more food, now our population begins to grow. Our population is healthier because more people have a sufficient amount of food. Okay? The primary thing that holds it back, for example, when women give birth to children, if they are of a lower weight, the child is of a lower weight, and the child is less likely to survive or be healthy. Same for the woman. So this is how population can decline. A lot of times for women, it was during childbirth, led to, say, the woman dying or getting sick, maybe eventually dying, the child, same way. If they're better health, if they're at a better weight, then all of that works better and you start to see the population grow. Also, with more efficient methods, you got more people, but you don't need as many people on the farm. And so those people can now go into towns and cities and begin to do work there. So why does this begin in England? I think that's a good question. Why in England? Why not in France? Why not in Spain or, Germany or someplace else? It begins in England, I think, for a variety of reasons. One of the important reasons is they have the capital. Remember I told you, I could start my pizzeria. I'd probably call it Grocki Brothers Pizza. And I would start it, but I would need hundreds of thousands of dollars probably to get it going, which I don't have. But in England, they got a lot of capital. Now, rich people like you will understand that if you got your money just sitting around, it's not making you any money. What you need to do is invest your money to make more money. Otherwise, your money just sits there. In other words, let's say you had $1 million. If you just had $1 million and you let the $1 million sit there, you're actually losing money because of what's called inflation. Even now, inflation's not that high, but let's say it's 3%. That means at the end of this year, you'd have 3% less out of your $1 million. And in 10 years, you'd have 30% less. See what I'm saying? In 20 years, you'd have 60% less. So you'd still have the $1 million, but it wouldn't buy as much. So what you really have to do if you have a lot of money, well, have any money, is you need to have that money grow. And it needs to grow at faster than the inflation rate for you to stay ahead. So that means you need more than 3%, typically, right, these days. So in England, they had a lot of money, but they don't like to just have it sitting around. They want to invest it, because that's the way they can make some money, by investing it. So they had it there, and they began to invest it in trade. And of course, textiles. Now, one of the things that England had plenty of was textiles. And these textiles that they had was what? Anybody know what kind of textile, kind of cloth they were making in England? Wool. Exactly. Give yourself an imaginary star, a gold star, platinum star. Yes, wool. Wool is the key. England had a lot of sheep, and England had a lot of wool, and that's what drove their textile thing. Now, wool's not so bad if you're in England, Scotland, Ireland. It's kind of chilly there, and wearing it. But you start going to warmer climates, like say down here in Florida, I venture to guess you probably don't have a lot of wool in your wardrobe, right? Maybe a little bit, but probably not much, because it's very warm. And as England began to want to spread its market, they knew they needed something else. Cotton was the way they were going to go. Cotton, cotton balls, so forth. That's what they needed. But guess what? Cotton will not grow in England. The climate will not, it has to have a much warmer climate to grow cotton. Okay? This is why England gets involved in so many places in the world, because they can grow cotton. They grow cotton in Egypt, they grow cotton in India. They are growing cotton or involved in cotton in the southern part of the United States. So, why is England involved in our Civil War? They're involved in our Civil War because of the cotton. They wanted the cotton. All right, so that's one thing. They had money, they needed trade, they needed to move that cotton in and out, move their goods in and out. They had efficient banking, which allowed them to make loans and so forth. They had natural resources in England. They had coal mines. They had iron mines. So they could mine the coal that would be the fuel. They could also get the iron, which they could then produce into iron, which could become the machinery of it. Another thing, England is relatively small geographically. That means you can move the goods, the coal, the textiles, the iron, everything you need to move. You don't have to move it that far because England's not that big. They have long coastlines, which means they could actually use shipping, boats to move it around, and on rivers, on barges and things. So they can move a lot of these goods on water. So these are some of the advantages of England. Money, banking, resources, relatively small side, and transportation. So in transportation, England also is building canals, roads, and bridges. Canals become something of the 19th century. Here in the United States, we built some canals as well during this period. I don't know, probably not too many in Florida, but in other parts, let's say in Pennsylvania, you might have heard of the Erie Canal, for example. Erie Canal. There are several other canals like that were built to connect, say, between the Ohio River and the Great Lakes, Lake Erie. That's what the Erie Canal is about. So basically, you can bring goods along the Great Lakes. So you can put them in this canal, get them on the Ohio River, move them all the way down to the Mississippi. You can move them all over the place on water. That was the key. So they're going to build a lot of canals in England, also roads and bridges. This all makes it easier to move things inland, to get materials, supplies, goods from one place to another in England. England also has a great navy. Excellent navy, which could sail all over the world, could also provide protection to merchants who are traveling around the world. They have a merchant fleet, cargo kind of ships that can move these things all over the world. So all of this assures then a worldwide network of transportation to the markets where the English, the British need to be. They need to be in a place where they can get the cotton. They need to be able to take the finished goods and sell them in different parts of the world. So, England, another reason why England is a place where this happens. Here's another one. It has to do with their government. The English did not have a restrictive government. They had a constitutional system which actually encouraged trade. Instead of the government trying to control all of it, the government had adopted many of the ideas of a guy named Adam Smith. You ever heard of Adam Smith? What does Adam Smith say about governments and economies?
Government should stay out of the economies.
Government stay out of the economy. Laissez-faire, it comes to be called. Leave your hands off of it. Yes, another gold star. Well, maybe platinum. We were giving out platinum. See, it's only so far up I can go. Well, anyway, yeah, Adam Smith is saying, leave it alone. Let this go. And so the ideas of Adam Smith have taken root. This encouraged trade. There are also technological changes that take place with the textiles, especially with cotton. They're moving from a manual system to a machine system. Do you see this, this device here? You see it has a wheel on it. The wheel has a handle. The handle was turned by hand, by a person. They spun it. And this is basically taking the fibers, in this case cotton fibers, or it could be wool fibers, and it's taking it and spinning it onto bobbins, or little rolls of thread, right? Once that gets rolled, it could then be used to weave into cloth. So you got to take the fibers, you got to get them into a kind of string or thread, then you got to take those strings or threads and then weave them together to make the cloth. Once you have the cloth, then of course it needs to be cut and sewn into a shirt, pants, or whatever it's going to be. So there's a lot of work involved in this. Now, the way it had been done in the past with making clothing is that it had been done in the home. This is what's called cottage industry. A cottage industry is not an industry that builds cottages, as I've had people write on a test. No. Cottage industry means that you're doing the work in your cottage. You're doing the work in your home. It was primarily done by women. Women who had a family, but they could find a few hours in a day or a week or whatever where they could do this work. Okay? So they might be spinning. They might be taking the fibers and spinning it into thread. Then they would be paid for how many of those they did. Then that would be taken to another woman, and that woman in another house would be weaving it. She'd have a loom and she'd be weaving it into cloth. She'd get paid for so many yards of cloth, right? Then someone else, again, another woman would take the cloth and cut it into whatever it's supposed to be, and maybe sew it into a shirt or something, okay? And she'd be paid by how many, it's called piecework, she'd be paid by how many pieces, how many garments she produced. She would get paid so much per garment. So that was all being done in the homes. And you kind of had, company that was moving the stuff around, coming up with the money, selling the products, but the women were typically paid per item. Well, we're going to mechanize this. This can no longer be done in the home. So that means you're going to move from the cottage to the factory. James Hargreaves is going to invent a spinning jenny in 1768. That's what you see pictured here, which was operated by hand. So a lot of the motion, a lot of the things that were invented had circular motion, right? Circular motion. You could spin a wheel, have a handle on it, and spin it. If we could mechanize that, bless you, if we can mechanize that, you can now go much faster because your arm's going to wear out after a while, right? Do it with your right arm, do it with your left arm, do it with your right arm. After a few hours of that, you're like, I need a break, right? So, but a machine just keeps going. But, of course, it's going to produce yarn. They're going to produce a lot of yarn that can then be woven into cloth, into textiles. But the problem, of course, is this can no longer be done in the home because you don't have the space. You also don't have the capital. A woman can't afford in her home, try to put one of these machines in there and operate it inside her house. Her house isn't that big. And how much does this machine cost? So we have to build a factory. Build a factory with the machines in it. The women then go to the factory and operate the machines and take care of basically doing similar kinds of things they used to do, but now with machines. And eventually those machines will be powered by steam. Other inventions that are going to help. Edmund Cartwright invents a power loom in 1787. This is, of course, for weaving. I don't know if you've ever seen somebody use a loom, or if you've ever used a loom, but there's a series of yarn going one direction, all right? and then it goes up and down like this, and you run something through with yarn on it this way, tighten it up, run it back through, run it back through, run it back through. Well, it's a lot of back and forth motion, up and down motion. Get a machine to do that, saves a lot of time, goes a lot faster. Machine loomed for weaving. Now, eventually, you can do this by hand with cranks, and you can have the machines devised to do it. But like we said, people wear out. They get tired. Machines go a lot longer without breaking down or slowing down. The way that's going to be powered is through a steam engine. The steam engine sort of began at first as a novelty. Somebody created it. It was used first of all to pump water out of mines, because basically it has an up and down piston, goes up and down, and so you can let the water run in, push it down, squirt the water out. So if you're down in a mine, like a coal mine, and it's starting to get water in it, you can have this thing pumping the water out. So a steam engine works pretty well. You put it outside so all the gases stay outside. You run a hose down, you start pumping the water out of the mine. It wasn't very efficient. It was okay for pumping out the water. They began to work on it. A guy named James Watt will work on it. He will make it more efficient. So he really makes it a more practical thing to be usable. So he's usually credited with that as sort of perfecting the steam engine. And like I said, it's first used to pump water out of mines. Once they're doing that, and they have this vertical motion, they have a vertical motion, it's a piston going up and down. The steam is shot into the piston, it raises the piston, the steam is released out of the piston drops. So you see that? Raise, let out, drop. Raise, drop. That's an up and down motion. The thing is, part of the problem is a lot of stuff what people need done is circular motion. So they had to devise a way to take the vertical motion and change it into circular motion. Once that happened, and that's with the rotary engine, now you've got all kinds of possibilities. So take a look at this drawing of the rotary engine. Notice there's a piston over here on the left in this tube. Notice there's a big flywheel. Notice here are rocker arms. So the piston goes up and down. That moves the rocker arm back and forth, which attaches to the flywheel, which now we have a circular motion being created from vertical motion. From up and down motion becomes circular motion. Now you're onto something. Now a lot of things can be attached to this because you got circular motion. Things like power looms, spinning jennies, the steam engine is going to become the standard way to operate that. And of course, eventually, if you got circular motion like this, people start to get the idea, you know what, if we could put this on some kind of on the ground, we could actually move forward with a circular motion. It's all powered by coal. The coal is burned, it heats up water, the water turns to steam, right? And the steam is shoots in because it's under pressure, then it shoots back out, and that's your up and down motion. So what this does then, there had been circular motion before. The circular motion and a lot of this kind of stuff had been done along a stream. Have you ever been to a grist mill? You know what I'm talking about? I say a grist mill. A water wheel. You ever seen a water wheel? Well, maybe, I don't know if you've got any in Florida, but you need a stream or a river that moves at a pretty good speed. You have a big wooden wheel. The wheel catches the water. The wheel spins. The wooden wheel spins. It's on a straight pole that goes into a building. Into that building, now that pole that is an axle and is spinning. You can then attach stuff to it, usually by a belt, a long belt, and then that can then turn and in turn spin some grinders, so you can grind up wheat into flour. That's what they call a grist mill. or any other kind of circular motion. The problem with it is, of course, you got to have the right kind of stream. So you have to build your sort of factory, your plate, your engine becomes a stream, and you are tied geographically to a place where that can work. With a steam engine, guess what? Good news, you can do it anywhere. Anywhere. So you can now bring the machinery to wherever you need it. So the textile production goes up, and the use of machineries goes up. Part of the problem with the use of the machines is that they had been built mostly out of wood. Wooden machinery, maybe with some metal banding or metal parts, but most of it wood, because it's easier to form into the shape they needed. But as production goes up, the use of cotton goes up. For example, in 1769, in England, they were using 2.2 million pounds of cotton in a year. That's a lot of cotton, especially when you consider not 1 pound of it was grown in England. You had to move all that cotton there. But take a look, 20 years later, 22 million pounds. It's gone up by quite a factor there, isn't it? And so that's in like 20 years. So now you go another 50 years, 366 million pounds of cotton. And again, not 1 pound of that cotton is grown in England. I don't know if you've ever dealt with cotton. It takes a lot of cotton to make a pound of cotton. Cotton is pretty light, so you really got to pack it together to get a pound of it. But at any rate, this means England has to get a hold of that much cotton somewhere and then transport it to England to be made into textiles, which could then be made into clothing, which could be sold. We also see the use of coal goes up. In 1850, they were using 4 times the amount of coal they used in 1815 for all these machines. Of course, that also means a lot more pollution, a lot of coal dust in the air and so forth. Iron production also improves because for the machinery to stay up with the speed of the engine, it's going to have to be built out of metal, out of iron. Part of the ways to do that is Henry Cort, the guy pictured here, comes up with a puddling method of iron production. Puddling. Basically what that means is you got to get the iron in a liquid form. While it's in the liquid form, you let it hold still in a container that puddles it, that puts it together. This allows impurities, which are lighter than the metal, to float to the surface. And then they can be skimmed off. That's what we call slag. Okay? So he sort of invented this thing, and it creates a lot purer iron. Purer method. Many moons ago, I actually worked in a steel mill at a bloomer mill, which did a very similar kind of thing. You heat it up enough, the impurities come to the surface, and they bloomed off. They would leak off of it. So you have a lot purer metal that's there. So the same kind of stuff's still going on today. How are they using the iron? Well, here you see what they do. One of the things is that once you have liquefied the iron, you can pour it in the molds. You can make it about any shape you need or want in molds. So in 1740, across England, they're using 17,000 tons of iron. 100 years later, they're using about 2 million tons of iron in a year. And by just 12 years later, they're using about 3 million tons. In fact, by the time you get to the 1850s, England is using more iron than everyone else in the world combined. Think about that. England's a relatively small country, but they are using more iron than all the rest of the world put together to make machinery. If you ever go to England, there's an interesting place you could visit. It's called Iron Bridge. It's a place where they made the first iron bridge. And it's in a valley where they produced the iron and all that kind of thing. They wanted to demonstrate how versatile it was, how strong it was. So they created this bridge well over 100 years ago. It's still standing. You can still go across the bridge today. It's an interesting town to visit, and they also have a kind of a demonstration like this of how they worked with the iron. Well, guess what? Locomotives. Somebody gets the idea, if we could take a coal-fired steam engine and put wheels on it and put it on a metal track, now we can move stuff across the ground without an animal, without a wagon. You do it on here with a locomotive. And by the way, again, if you ever go to England, I recommend you go visit the city of York. York. Have you heard of the grand old Duke of York who had 10,000 men? He marched them up the hill and he marched them down again. Well, that's an old song. But York is an amazing town. Has a lot of Viking stuff. It has Roman stuff. But it also has, and this surprised me because I didn't know it was there till I went to visit York, have a very large railroad museum, which I recommend to you. It's fascinating. Have all these, including these things that I'm talking about here. Some of the very first steam engines, steam locomotives, they have them there. They have it. They have this one there, the Rocket. The Rocket. Richard Trevithick from Wales develops the first steam-powered locomotive, which he names the Rocket. And it is able, you see what it looks like here, it's just basically a steam engine with, see the smokestack, and you see behind it a little cart that has coal on it. You got to shovel the coal in, keep it running. It could pull 10 tons of ore and 75 people. Now, try that with a horse, right? It's going to take a lot of horses to do that. And from there, it just starts improving. George Stephenson, he's the one with the rocket, not Richard Trevithick, sorry. Richard Trevithick gets the first locomotive. Stephenson has the rocket. The rocket then, it calls it that because it goes 16 miles an hour. And so this becomes the average speed in 1830 for a train. And he's moving between two important cities for industry, Liverpool and Manchester. So they actually lay track between those two cities. They can move stuff back and forth. Because remember, Liverpool is a harbor. Manchester has got all the factories, or a lot of factories, moving goods and stuff back and forth. But guess what? By 1850, they've got these locomotives and the trains going 50 miles an hour. 50 miles an hour. Now, still today, we use trains, and there are some really fancy trains, like bullet trains and stuff that go pretty fast. But most of our trains that we have in the United States today aren't going a whole lot faster than 50 miles an hour. They're definitely under 100 miles an hour, maybe up to 70 miles an hour, something like that. So what I'm saying is, here, now, 150 years ago or more, 160 years ago, they were having stuff moving at 50 miles an hour down a track, and they're pulling heavy weights. That's pretty impressive, and that's going to change things. The railroad will increase because to have the trains move, you got to have the tracks. In 1830, there was 2,000 miles of track in England. By 1850, 3 times that, 6,000 miles of track. These railroad lines create jobs that had never existed before. For example, building tracks and maintaining tracks, building locomotives and trains and maintaining them, being an engineer on a train, loading and unloading the trains. All these were jobs that did not exist a few years before. So industry picks up. People have jobs now that are very different than they would have had, say, 50 years before. And the other thing that this does perhaps in a more philosophical way, is that people begin to sort of feel like nature doesn't control them. They can control nature. We pretty much feel that way, I guess, until a hurricane comes or something like that. In other words, the mountain, no, the mountain's not, we can get that stuff. We'll either blow a hole through the mountain, we'll go over the top of the mountain, we'll go around it, we'll go over it, we'll go under it. We're not going to let a mountain, a hill, an incline, we're not going to let a river or something stop us. We'll just build a bridge over it, an iron bridge right over the top of it or whatever. So we can now we now can go and kind of control nature, subdue it into what we want it to be. And yeah, pretty much in your life today, my guess would be most of the time, nature doesn't play much of a, you're not too concerned about it on a daily basis. Okay, maybe you're going to have to wear a jacket today to go from your air-conditioned or heated home to your air-conditioned or heated vehicle to go to your air-conditioned or heated place where you work. You might get a few raindrops on you. You might get a little chilly. You might get a little hot. But other than that, you don't worry too much about it. You're much more worried about if your internet goes out. If the Wi-Fi's down, it's a panic. There's no Wi-Fi. That happened to me about a week ago at my house. And I call them. They said, well, it's out. I said, well, when's it going to be back? I said, oh, about an hour. They lie. They'll lie to you. It was like 7 hours. I didn't have any Wi-Fi. I was trying to get work done. What am I going to do? Not only that, but since my television was through the same company, there was no television either. There was no television. There was no Wi-Fi. There was no nothing. So, what am I going to do? How could people survive without the Wi-Fi and the cable? Well, factories. Now, here's another thing. Factories, yes. Labor was organized much differently in a factory than on a farm. On a farm, there is a cycle to your work, right? In the spring, you've got to get everything ready to plant. You got to get all the crops in the ground. You got to get the fields ready, get them plowed, get everything in there, get everything set up so that everything can start to grow. Now, of course, I grew up where you actually had winter. So you had, Florida. I don't know how they do it in Florida. That's a whole other thing. But let's say across the Midwest, you got to get everything planted in the spring, April, March, April. If you don't get stuff planted in time, it's not going to mature in time before you get a frost in the fall. And then you get nothing. You see? So it's very time sensitive. In the spring, we got a lot of work to do. In the fall, we got to get all this stuff out of the fields while we can, while it's ready, and before the weather gets bad, we got to get everything out. So those are two very intense times. Planting season, harvest season, for whatever crops you have. Now, in between, yes, there are maintenance things. There's maybe some weeding, maybe some other things that are going on there. But it's not as intense. And then in the winter, you got to do different kind of work because you're not, your crops aren't growing in the winter. This is when you repair your equipment. This is when you plan what you're going to do. So what I'm saying is that your work in a course of a year, over 12 months, you have really intense times, you have times not as intense. You might be doing one kind of job, but when you get up in the morning on a farm, you may end up doing a variety of different jobs. You may have to fix some equipment. You may have to drive some stuff around. You may have to, plant something, harvest something. You never know what you're going to do. And your job changes a little each day. It's not exact. But you go to a factory. I don't know if you've ever worked in a factory. What they don't like you to have is variety. They want you doing the same thing every day, all day. Why? Because they want you to get so proficient at it, you don't even think about it, what you're doing. That means you get fast, you get efficient. So, they don't want to move you around from place to place. They want you to be in one spot. So this is different because on a farm, you're going to need a lot of labor to plant and a lot of labor to harvest. You won't need as much labor, say in the summer or in the winter. But at a factory, you need the same amount of labor all the time. You need regular work time, regular work hours. At a farm, what are your work hours? Well, I get up before the sun comes up, I get things ready, I work all day while the sun is out, and then at night, I see what, of course, now on farms, you got lights on your tractors and stuff, you keep working at night. It used to be you had to stop. But you had kind of a set thing, and you might work 12, 14-hour days in harvest and in planting, and then maybe less in the summer and the winter. Factories, you don't get that. They want you to work the same amount of hours, same kind of thing, all the time. Regular work, regular hours. Because machines are expensive, and having a place to house them is expensive, and they want to make sure they make a profit. The other thing that becomes clear, not only with sort of regular hours, right, regular hours and a regular job, is that you also begin to create a distinction between the person or people who own the factory and the people who work at the factory. See, on the farm, most of the work is done by the guy that owns the farm. The farmer does the work, maybe the farmer's children, maybe the farmer will hire a few people to work for him, but it's pretty clear that the farmer is in this all the way. He's 100% in, right? If things don't go well, the farmer's in big trouble. If I work at a factory, guess what? I get done with my job, I'm done. If it doesn't go well, it doesn't go well. I'll be back tomorrow. See, it's a very different attitude. I'm not all in because I don't own it. I'm going to get paid whatever I get paid per hour or per day, and that's it. Whether they do really well or they don't do really well. To me, it doesn't matter. Pre-industrialized work was not time. You work in spurts, or you work in intense periods. For example, I've done some farm work, right? Normally I was a hired hand. A lot of times you get paid, like say you're baling hay, they might pay you a little bit for every bale you baled. If you could do that faster, well, in other words, they didn't used to pay farm workers by the hour. They would pay farm workers by the job. I need you to plow this field and plant it, and if you do that, I'll give you this amount of money. Now, as long as you do it right, you get it done, I don't really care how long it takes you. I'd rather you get it done faster than shorter, as long as you do it right. I'm still going to pay you the same amount. At a factory, they pay you a fixed amount per hour. This idea of being paid by the hour, that comes with the industrialization. Well, industrialization begins to spread. It first spreads from England to Belgium, and then after that to France, and then eventually to Germany and the United States. France is never as industrialized, say, as Belgium or Germany. Spain is almost not industrial. There's no industrial revolution in Spain at all. And after 1850, it spreads to other parts of the world. Other parts of the world as well. Because the British are taking it with them. The British are the ones who come up with this, and people begin to borrow and modify British ideas into their what works for them. The United States is so huge compared to England being relatively small that the ideas are taken and modified here. Speaking of the United States, we don't talk a lot about the United States in this class, but here is one screen where we do. Here is an idyllic image of the United States, let's say around 1800. Agrarian, take a look at that. They got horses, going to pull a plow. You got a wagon. You got the farmer there with his family. You can see the house in the background, right? They brought his lunch out to him. He's going to stop and eat lunch, and he's going to get back to work. this is sort of the image. And, not just the image, it's fairly real, fairly a reality for much of the United States, let's say in 1800. In 1800, it had an agrarian economy. There were no cities in the United States over 100,000 people. 100,000 people is about what Lakeland has. So these were the largest cities in the United States. It was like about the size of what Lakeland is here. And the total population of all the United States was 5 million people. 5 million people, that's all. That's at 1800. There were 16 states in 1800. Those 16 states were along the coast, the Atlantic coast. Just a couple of states a little bit inland. Most all the people lived east of the Appalachian Mountains. All right, so that is a picture of the United States in 1800. And so here is what probably a familiar looking map to you of what things look like in 1800. You got all the original 13 colonies there. You got Florida. Yeah, we're there. You got Kentucky and Tennessee. Some land claimed to be part of Georgia and Mississippi. But, those haven't really been organized very well yet. I doubt Florida is well organized in 1800 either. And so most of the people are living lined up in here, and there's 5 million people. By the time 60 years later, in 1860, instead of the majority of the people being farmers, only about a half of the people are farmers. You now have 9 cities over 100,000 in 1860, including places like, New York, Chicago, and so forth. And the population has grown from 5 million in 60 years to 30 million people. 6 times the population. And most of that, a lot of that is from immigration, people coming to the United States. And we have now 34 states, more than doubled the number of states. And the population is split, about half on the west of the Appalachian Mountains and half east of the Appalachian Mountains. And so by this time in the 19th century, the United States is borrowing the idea of industrialization from the English, borrowing it, and really exceeding what they did. Because we need to do it on a grander scale, and we got a different situation. One of the things that develops here in the United States is a riverboat. Don't have that in England. The paddle wheel riverboat, because we have some very large rivers, right? The Mississippi, the Ohio, the Missouri. These are all very large rivers that move through the center and then up and down north to south. You can tie things together along these rivers. Another thing that we develop here is the idea of interchangeable parts. That's an American idea. Especially happens with handguns and other kinds of guns, and eventually with all sorts of things. That you don't need to make, in the past if something broke, you'd have it be broken. You'd have to take it to a blacksmith. The blacksmith would try to fashion something to repair it or to replace it. So each thing was kind of unique. Each thing was sort of custom made. But we're going to start this idea that there's interchangeable parts. If one part breaks, you can take that part out and put in a replacement part and still use it. Now we've gone full circle again. Most of the stuff we have today you cannot repair. Very little of it can be repaired this day. You're supposed to throw it away and buy a new one. Right on down to your iPhone, right? They don't want you to repair your iPhone. They don't even want you to put a new battery in your iPhone. They make it so hard and so forth. I did it once to an early iPhone I had. I bought it. I got it used. I got it kind of and the battery started to go out. And this is one of those early iPhones. And so I contacted him. I said, well, I need to get a battery in here. And he said, well, that's going to cost, it's going to cost me more than I paid for the phone. I said, well, I don't want to do that. And I said, what if I do it? And they said, well, if you do it, you're going to void the warranty. And I said, well, yeah, but the thing doesn't work anyway. So what's the difference? So I gave it a shot. I actually took the iPhone apart. I ordered a battery online for like $3. And I put the battery in it. You know what held it in? Double-sided tape. That's what holds in the battery. It's not in any kind of little thing. It's just stuck. It's stuck on the front, like where the screen is. It just stuck there. They don't even put it on the back to make it easier. You gotta dig all the way through the phone to get to it because they do not want you to replace this battery. So you got to take the screen off. You got to do all this stuff. And you go all the way in the back. Take all these screws out. You finally get to the battery. Take the battery, put the battery in. Now you got to put it all back together again. Could just have a little flap on the back, where you could slide a battery in. It'd be very easy to do. But they don't want you to do that. So we've now designed things that you will get rid of them instead of repairing them. We're doing that with a lot of appliances. We're doing that with like phones. We're doing a lot of stuff. Cars, you can still sort of fix a car. But but interchangeable parts revolutionize things. Machines, guns, agricultural equipment, all made with interchangeable parts. So if a handle broke on a gun, you just get a new handle. Put it on the gun, put it back together. So on. Same with farm equipment and so forth. Roads and canals were built in the United States. Steamboat was a key thing to transportation here because we had a lot of rivers, especially along the Ohio and Mississippi Valley. These steamboats could be used to move people, goods, up and down the rivers. So here's a map that kind of shows where the resources are. You see the purplish color, that's where coal is located in the United States. Those Appalachian Mountains, where I used to live there in Kentucky, West Virginia, and so forth. A lot of coal there. Look where there's iron. Iron is up in Pennsylvania, up into New York. The only other place you have iron is down here in Alabama. And so you're actually going to get some industrialization around Birmingham, Alabama. They will have some steel mills, some metal work and railroad stuff there. Then silver and gold mines, look at that, Georgia and down in here, and there's some stuff out in the west. Well, you can see then most of the manufacturing of the United States is going to be up here in the Northeast, some of it like around Chicago, but most of it's up here in the East Coast. Why? Because you have the coal and you have the iron. Okay? Therefore, easier to build the factories there. All right. By the way, this also can help you understand the Civil War. The Civil War was really, there's a lot of factors to it, but one of the factors of the Civil War was over economy. Are you going to have factories or are you going to have agriculture? In the South, they didn't hardly have any factories. They were dependent upon large farming activities of very intense crops that take a lot of man hours, a lot of labor, like cotton and tobacco and stuff like that. In the North, they're not messing with any of that. They're building factories and they're becoming industrialized. So the North is industrialized, the South is not. The South is backed, say, by England. Why? Because they're raising the cotton. So in part, it's also an economic struggle, a cultural struggle. There's a lot of parts to it. But that's one way to think about it. The industrialization was in the North. It wasn't really in the South. Railroads. Well, in 1860, there were 1,000 steamboats on the Mississippi. Think about that, 1,000 big ships. And the railroads begin to grow. 100 miles in 1830, that's all. By 1860, by the time of the Civil War, over 27,000 miles of track, and most of that was in the north. The South had very few train tracks. They had some to go to some major cities, but in the north they were crisscrossed with train tracks for the industry. The Northeast was the U.S. industrial center. Okay? Now, the next thing I'm going to show you here is a animated view of how the United States is settled. And I'll let it run through a couple of times. Here we go. Notice the years are ticking off up there at the top. And then you can see the United States being divided into eventually counties. First states, then sort of regions, then counties to 1940, 1950, 1983. Here's 1650. Notice everything's starting along rivers, along the Ohio, the Mississippi, 1830, 1840. Now suddenly 1850 they jump out west. Why? Gold rush. And they leave the stuff in the middle because it's just, there's a lot of uncharted territory there until they finally get it. I'll let it go one more time and then we'll move on. We still have a couple more slides to try to get done here today. But I think this, kind of illustrates something about how the United States developed from east to west. Notice Oklahoma doesn't get settled until later, right, when they have the land rush there. Well, let's move on. Let's talk about the social impact of the Industrial Revolution. The population is growing in Europe. 140 million, 1750. 50 years later, 187 million. By 1850, 266 million is the estimate in Europe. The food supply is up, the death rate is down, the population is growing. We also see the growth of very large cities. For example, London. In 1800, London is 1 million people. By 1850, it's 2.3 million people living in London. There are 6 cities, 50 to 100,000. By 1850, there are 18 cities in England, 50 to 100,000. So it becomes urbanized, it becomes industrialized, and of course all this is going to bring about a change to people's lives from rural to urban, from agriculture to industry. Okay? So I'm going to move on, but you'll be able to look this. I'm going to try to post this today, so if you don't get it all written down, don't feel bad. I got about 4 more screens, and we got about 5 more minutes, so that's my goal right now. Britain in 1850, the food supply goes up, the death rate goes down, and by the time you get to 1850, about half of the population is living in cities. Now, one of the things that's going to happen as people begin to live in the cities, there are lots of social problems that rise up. One of the problems is with pollution and sanitation. You got a lot of coal dust everywhere. If you want some examples of this, you could read some stories by Charles Dickens, right? He describes England at about this time. The coal dust, the factories, the orphans, the different things that he describes in his various stories. But sanitation problems, they don't have sufficient sewer set up for this millions and millions of people in London. You got coal there. Also, a lot of alcohol consumption goes way up. People are not as happy with their lives. Their lives are filled with work. They're working very long days. And so when they get out of work, instead of going home, a lot of times they go to a pub, they go to a bar, and they drink. Prostitution is also up. Pollution is up. Disease is up, like cholera. Because again, there's not the sort of social restraint. If everybody knows who you are in a small town, it might mean you don't do certain things that you might otherwise do because you know everybody will find out. If you're in a city where nobody's going to find out, nobody knows who you are, people do things. Plus, if you go into the city, you don't have the social network, you don't have the safety net. If you're a woman and your husband gets killed in a factory or gets hurt so you can't work and now you need money, some of these women begin to turn to things like prostitution that wouldn't have never thought of that if they hadn't lived in the city. Working conditions are very harsh. Working conditions very harsh. The factories have very long hours. People are sometimes working 12 to 14 to 16 hours a day and are doing that 6 days a week. There is no school for kids. Kids are working as well. Children are working. Coal mines are very dangerous with bad air and explosions and collapsing. 2 more screens. Women and children in the workforce. They're working long hours as well. Children are climbing under machines. They're going in between machines. They're working in textile mills. Because in the past, children had always worked on the farm. They are now working in the factories. They're going with their mothers to the textile mills. It's very low pay. And so even though the woman is working, the husband is working, sometimes many of the children are working, they still aren't making a lot of money. And here's our last screen. This is some legislation that begins to change some of this. They're called the Factory Acts between 1802 and 1819. 19 to 16-year-olds were limited by the Factory Acts over that period of time, limited eventually to only working 12-hour days, 6 days a week, and only working in textile mills, not working in coal mines and other places like that. The Factory Act of 1833 set the minimum age for a child to work at 9. And if you're 9 to 13, you work 8 hours. If you're 13 to 18, you work 12 hours. If you're over 18, then you're probably working 16 hours. Then there was a 10-hour act, which basically, also known as the Factory Act of 1847, which said now that teenagers, 13 to 18, could only work 10-hour days. Yes?
So, like, what was the school system like?
There was no school system.
So they just, like, kind of, once they were 8, pretty much they started working?
Yeah, and they didn't going to school before that either. There was no school. That's why people's churches started what they called Sunday schools, because Sunday was the only day children could attend a kind of school, and that's where they started to teach them how to read the Bible, how to have something for them on Sundays. So that's really the Sunday school develops in the 19th century in England. All right, we finished it. Have a good day.